Wow, I was completely blindsided when I discovered what my wife had been hiding from me. It all began with a casual suggestion, the kind you make without considering it might change everything. "Why don't you try Pilates?" I'd said to Lisa one evening as she massaged her shoulders after another long day at work. "It might help with your back pain." She had looked at me, skeptical at first, but by the following week, she was enrolled in a class at the new fitness studio in town. It was one of those places that radiated modern wellness, bright, airy, and full of promises for a better, more balanced life. She came back from her first session glowing, talking about how great the instructor was. "Trey's just amazing," she'd said. "He really knows his stuff." At the time, I'd been happy for her. After years of marriage, seeing Lisa excited about something other than the kids or her demanding job felt refreshing. She started going twice a week. Then 3 times. Soon, it was every day, each session seemingly indispensable. "You're going again?" I asked one Saturday morning as she tied her sneakers. "Yep," she replied, a little too breezily. "It's the only thing that's been helping my back." I had no reason to doubt her, at least, not then. It's funny how subtle changes can start to gnaw at you. A misplaced sock, an unusual perfume lingering in the air. With Lisa, it was the way she started guarding her phone. She'd always been so open, her screen buzzing on the kitchen counter without a second thought. Now, it was never out of her sight. One evening, as we sat watching TV, I glanced over. She wasn't scrolling Instagram or texting her sister. She was smiling genuinely, softly, at her screen. It wasn't a smile I saw much anymore, at least not directed at me. "Who's got you so amused?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Oh, just a group chat," she said quickly, locking her phone. "You wouldn't get it." The first time I suggested joining her at Pilates, she looked at me like I'd proposed we take up synchronized swimming. "I don't think it's your thing, Matt," she'd said, laughing. "Besides, it's mostly women." "So?" I could use the stretch. My back's not exactly in perfect shape either. "You'd hate it," she insisted, her voice a little too firm. "Trust me." That should have been my cue to drop it. But something about the way she brushed me off didn't sit right. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention. Her Pilates bag always seemed freshly packed. She spent more time getting ready for these classes than she ever did for a date night with me. And then there were the nights she came home late, always with an excuse, errands, catching up with a friend, a long chat with one of her classmates. It wasn't just her schedule that changed. It was the way she seemed lighter somehow, her eyes brighter. But that lightness never extended to me. I first met Trey by accident. I'd swung by the studio one evening, intending to surprise Lisa and take her out to dinner. Trey was hard to miss, tall, athletic, with the kind of easy charm that made people gravitate toward him. He greeted me with a wide smile that felt a touch too polished. "You must be Lisa's husband," he said, extending a hand. His grip was firm, his demeanor friendly. "That's me," I replied, trying to read him. "She talks about you a lot." "All good things, I hope," he said with a grin. I wanted to dislike him, but there wasn't much to dislike. He was polite, confident, and undeniably good at his job. Lisa, seeing us together, seemed flustered in a way that was both flattering and unnerving. Weeks passed, and my unease grew. Lisa started texting more often during dinner, and I'd catch her glancing at her phone with that same faint smile. One evening, while she showered, I gave in to an urge I wasn't proud of and glanced at her phone. It was locked. She'd changed her passcode. I told myself I was imagining things, that she was just engrossed in her newfound passion. But late one night, unable to sleep, I drove past the studio. Her car wasn't there. The next morning, I confronted her. "Where were you last night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "At Pilates, like I told you," she replied without missing a beat. "Really?" "Because your car wasn't there." She froze for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable, but enough to confirm what I feared. "I went for coffee after." "You're being ridiculous, Matt." I started watching more closely, tracking the inconsistencies, piecing together the gaps in her stories. I didn't want to believe it, but the signs were all there. The late nights. The guarded phone. The way she seemed to light up at the mention of Trey's name. I even staked out the studio once, hiding in my car across the street. It felt absurd, like something out of a bad detective movie. But then I saw them, Lisa and Trey, walking out together. They didn't do anything overtly inappropriate, just stood by her car talking. But the way she leaned toward him, the way he touched her arm when he laughed, it was more intimate than any embrace. I didn't confront her that night. I wasn't ready. But I knew, deep down, that whatever was happening between them wasn't innocent. Here is the second part of the story, continuing from where the first left off. The next few weeks were a blur of doubt and dread, like watching a storm build on the horizon but being powerless to stop it. Lisa carried on as if nothing had changed, slipping into her leggings and tank tops and heading off to the studio with that same cheerful smile. I, on the other hand, couldn't shake the image of her and Trey standing so close, laughing like old friends, or more. It haunted me, creeping into my thoughts during work meetings, during the quiet moments before sleep, and even during the times we shared as a family. I debated whether to confront her outright, to ask what was going on between her and Trey. But each time I rehearsed the conversation in my head, I came up short. What would I even say? I saw you talking to your Pilates trainer, care to explain? It sounded ridiculous, paranoid even. And yet, deep down, I knew there was more to it than a casual student-teacher relationship. Lisa's behavior didn't help. She was distant, distracted. When I tried to kiss her goodnight, she'd turn her head just slightly, so my lips brushed her cheek instead of her mouth. She still laughed at my jokes, still asked about my day, but it all felt rehearsed, like she was checking off boxes to avoid suspicion. The warmth that had defined our relationship, the easy intimacy, was gone. One Friday evening, as she was getting ready for another class, I made a decision. "I'll drop you off tonight," I said casually, watching her as she rifled through her bag. She froze for a second, then turned to me with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's sweet, but there's no need. I'll just drive myself." "I don't mind. I'll pick you up afterward too. We can grab a bite somewhere." Her hesitation was barely perceptible, but it was there, like a crack in a perfectly painted wall. "Maybe another time," she said, slipping her bag over her shoulder. "I'll be late tonight, anyway." Late. The word hung in the air like a challenge, daring me to follow her. And follow her I did. I waited until she was a few blocks away before grabbing my keys and getting into the car. My heart pounded as I tailed her, keeping just enough distance to avoid being seen. I half hoped she was telling the truth, that I'd find her car parked neatly outside the studio, her shadow visible through the wide windows as she moved through the familiar routines. But when she drove past the studio and turned onto a quieter street, my stomach sank. She pulled into a small parking lot outside a trendy cafe, the kind with low lighting and an extensive wine list. A few minutes later, Trey's car pulled in beside hers. They got out and greeted each other with easy familiarity, their smiles too bright, too comfortable. They went inside together. I stayed in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. They weren't doing anything scandalous, not yet. Just two people having dinner. But something about the way they moved together, the unspoken understanding, the way Trey held the door open for her, made it clear this wasn't just Pilates. When Lisa came home that night, I didn't mention what I'd seen. Instead, I lay awake beside her, staring at the ceiling and wondering how things had come to this. The next time I followed her, I wasn't so lucky. They weren't at a cafe or a restaurant. They were standing outside the studio, close enough to touch, their faces illuminated by the glow of the street lamp. And they were kissing. Not the kind of kiss you'd exchange with a friend or even a casual fling. This was deep, intimate, and far too comfortable. They didn't see me. If they had, I don't know what I would have done. Yelled? Confronted them? Driven off? Instead, I sat frozen, watching as my wife, the woman I'd shared a life with for years, pressed her lips against another man's and smiled. When they finally broke apart and walked to their cars, I waited until they were gone before heading home. Lisa returned later, her smile as bright as ever, her story seamless. "The class was great tonight," she said, slipping out of her shoes. "I'm really starting to feel stronger." I nodded, unable to meet her eyes. The words I wanted to say, the accusations I wanted to hurl, caught in my throat. What if I was wrong? What if I was right? Either way, I wasn't ready for the answers. So, I stayed silent. Silent and complicit, as my marriage unraveled one secret at a time. The days that followed felt like walking through quicksand, each moment pulling me deeper into the murk of doubt and betrayal. Every glance Lisa threw my way, every casual touch, felt tinged with insincerity. I wanted to confront her, to lay it all out and demand the truth, but the words wouldn't come. What if she denied it? What if she admitted it? Either answer would crack the fragile illusion of normalcy I was desperately trying to maintain. I began avoiding her. When she left for her classes, I made excuses to stay late at work. When she sat beside me on the couch, I suddenly remembered emails I had to respond to. We still talked, of course, about the kids, about the grocery list, about anything that didn't require real connection. But even in those small exchanges, I felt like an intruder in my own home, a stranger watching my marriage crumble from the outside. One night, as Lisa hummed softly to herself in the kitchen, I pulled out my laptop and began searching. Not for answers, I already knew those, but for understanding. Affair forums, advice columns, even psychological studies about infidelity, I devoured them all. They told me what I already knew: the late nights, the guarded phone, the sudden, inexplicable glow. They were textbook signs of an affair. But what I didn't find was what to do next. The thought of hiring a private investigator crossed my mind more than once. I even went so far as to bookmark a few websites. But the idea of someone else knowing, of sharing this intimate, humiliating secret, was unbearable. Instead, I started keeping my own notes, recording her comings and goings, the times she left and the times she returned. I wanted a pattern, something concrete, even though my gut already screamed the truth. And then there was Trey. His name felt like a splinter under my skin. I couldn't stop picturing his smug smile, the easy way he'd said, "She talks about you a lot." Did she? What did she say? I began replaying our brief interaction, looking for clues, signs of his involvement. He was polished, confident, everything I wasn't. One evening, Lisa mentioned an upcoming class trip, an intensive weekend workshop hosted by Trey. "It's for advanced students," she explained, her tone casual. "A few of us are going to focus on some new techniques." "Sounds interesting," I said, barely masking my skepticism. "Where's it happening?" She hesitated for just a moment too long. "The studio. We'll be there most of the day, but we might grab dinner afterward. You know, as a group." "Dinner? Of course. Do you want me to pick you up?" I asked, testing the waters. "No need. I'll just drive myself. It might run late." Her words hung between us, and for a moment, her eyes darted away, avoiding mine. It was the final confirmation I needed. The weekend arrived, and Lisa left early, dressed in her sleek workout gear and carrying a bag that seemed overly packed for Pilates. I followed an hour later, parking a discreet distance from the studio. For most of the day, her car didn't move. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, I saw her and Trey leave together, slipping into his car. My chest tightened as I watched them drive away. I followed, careful to keep my distance. They ended up at a cozy little restaurant tucked away in a quiet corner of town. Through the large windows, I could see them seated at a corner table, their heads bent close together as they talked. They looked happy. For a moment, I almost convinced myself it was innocent. Maybe they were just friends. Maybe the kiss I'd seen outside the studio had been a mistake, an isolated incident. But then Trey reached across the table and took her hand. She didn't pull away. Instead, she smiled, her face lighting up in a way I hadn't seen in years. I stayed in the car, unable to look away. They lingered for hours, lost in their own world. When they finally left, Lisa leaned into him as they walked to the car. He opened the door for her, his hand resting briefly on her lower back. That night, when she returned home, she greeted me with the same breezy warmth as always. "The workshop went great," she said, kicking off her shoes. "We made so much progress." "That's good to hear," I replied, forcing a smile. Inside, I was unraveling. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. Work emails went unanswered, phone calls were ignored. My mind was a storm of questions. How long had this been going on? Did she feel guilty? Or had she convinced herself this was somehow justified? When Lisa left for her next class, I found myself in our bedroom, searching her closet, her drawers, her Pilates bag, anything that might hold a clue. And then I found it, a receipt, crumpled and forgotten in her bag. Dinner for two at the same restaurant I'd seen them at. My hand shook as I stared at it, the neatly printed names of dishes mocking me. I tucked it back where I'd found it, my chest heavy with the weight of knowing. That night, Lisa slid into bed beside me, her warmth a painful reminder of the distance between us. I wanted to ask her, to demand the truth, but instead, I turned away, staring into the darkness. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she didn't care. As her breathing slowed and she drifted into sleep, I lay awake, wondering how much more of this I could take. The truth was a heavy thing, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. Every moment with Lisa felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between suspicion and silence. Each smile she offered, each casual kiss on the cheek, felt like a cruel reminder of what I'd seen, what I knew. I thought I could handle it, but the cracks in my resolve were starting to show. I began avoiding her more deliberately. When she asked about dinner plans, I told her I was swamped with work. When she suggested a movie night, I claimed exhaustion. She noticed, of course. "Are you okay, Matt?" she asked one evening, her voice tinged with concern. "Just a lot on my plate," I replied, not meeting her eyes. She didn't press further, and I wondered if she was relieved that I wasn't asking the same of her. The weekend Pilates workshop haunted me, replaying in my mind on a loop. Lisa's laughter, Trey's hand on hers, the ease with which they moved around each other. I couldn't decide what hurt more, the fact that she was betraying me or the possibility that she was happy doing it. I tried to distract myself, throwing myself into work and hobbies. But even the things I once loved, reading, woodworking, taking the kids to the park, felt hollow. Every quiet moment was filled with questions I couldn't answer. Did she still love me? Did she ever? One evening, I came home to find Lisa in the living room, her phone in hand. She didn't notice me at first, too engrossed in whatever was on the screen. I stood in the doorway, watching her smile, a smile I hadn't seen in months. When she finally looked up, she seemed startled. "Hey," she said, slipping her phone into her pocket. "Hey," I replied, my voice sharper than I intended. She hesitated, then stood and walked over, placing a hand on my arm. "Are you sure everything's okay? You've been distant." I wanted to laugh at the irony of her concern. Instead, I pulled away, heading for the kitchen. "I'm fine," I said over my shoulder. The tension between us grew thicker with each passing day. Lisa seemed to sense it but didn't address it, as if acknowledging it might bring it to life. I, on the other hand, was teetering on the edge of confrontation, the words bubbling just beneath the surface. It came to a head one Friday night. Lisa had just come back from another class, her cheeks flushed, her hair slightly disheveled. I was sitting in the living room, nursing a glass of whiskey, when she walked in. "You're up late," she said, setting her bag by the door. "Couldn't sleep," I replied, swirling the amber liquid in my glass. She hesitated, then sat down across from me. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "I feel like we're out of sync," she said finally, her voice soft. "Like something's bothering you." I looked at her, the woman I'd shared years of my life with, and felt a surge of anger and sadness. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I asked, my tone deceptively calm. She blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" I leaned forward, setting my glass on the coffee table. "I mean, is there something you've been keeping from me? Something you think I don't know?" Her face paled slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might confess. But then her expression hardened, and she straightened in her seat. "Matt, what's going on? Why are you acting like this?" The deflection stung, but I didn't press further. "Not yet." "Forget it," I said, standing up. "I'm tired." I left her sitting there, her eyes following me as I walked upstairs. That night, I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities. The next morning, Lisa was back to her usual self, chatting about the kids and weekend plans as if nothing had happened. But the distance between us was palpable, a chasm that neither of us seemed willing to cross. The breaking point came a week later. Lisa had another evening class, and I decided I couldn't stay silent anymore. As she left, I waited for the door to close before grabbing my keys. I followed her again, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, they didn't go to the studio or a restaurant. They went to a park, a quiet, secluded spot on the edge of town. I parked a safe distance away and watched as they sat on a bench, talking in low voices. And then it happened. Trey reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. She leaned into his touch, her head tilting just slightly as he kissed her. It wasn't the kind of kiss you could excuse or explain away. It was slow, deliberate, intimate. I felt my stomach drop, the air leaving my lungs in a rush. I wanted to storm over, to confront them right then and there. But my feet were rooted to the ground, my body frozen with shock and rage. When they finally pulled apart, Lisa rested her head on his shoulder, a contented smile on her face. They stayed that way for a while before getting up and walking back to their cars. I sat there long after they'd gone, staring at the empty bench where my wife had kissed another man. That night, when Lisa came home, she was glowing, her cheeks flushed in a way I hadn't seen in years. "Class was amazing," she said, slipping off her shoes. I didn't respond, just nodded and walked past her to the kitchen. The confrontation was coming, I could feel it. But not tonight. Tonight, I needed time to figure out what came next. The days after seeing them at the park passed in a haze. I went through the motions at work, nodded along during conversations, and made an effort to seem present with the kids, but inside, I was a mess. My anger simmered just below the surface, kept in check by the fear of what would happen when I finally let it out. Lisa, oblivious or indifferent, carried on as usual. She was cheerful at the dinner table, chatting about her day and asking the kids about school. She even tried to initiate conversations with me, but I couldn't muster more than a few monosyllabic replies. "Matt," she said one evening after the kids had gone to bed, "you've barely said 2 words to me all week. What's going on?" I stared at her for a moment, my chest tightening. Part of me wanted to unleash everything I was holding in, to tell her I knew, to demand an explanation. But another part, the part that still clung to the life we'd built together, held me back. "I've just been stressed," I lied, my voice hollow. She frowned, studying me. "You know you can talk to me, right? About anything?" The irony was almost laughable. I forced a nod. "I know." She didn't press further, but the look in her eyes told me she wasn't convinced. That night, I lay awake long after she'd fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and replaying the scene in the park over and over. Her smile, the way she leaned into Trey, the kiss, it was burned into my memory, a cruel reminder of how far we'd drifted apart. By the weekend, I couldn't take it anymore. The tension was eating away at me, and I knew I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Lisa was leaving for another class, another excuse to see him, and as she grabbed her bag, I stopped her. "We need to talk," I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. She paused, glancing at the clock. "Now. I'm going to be late. This can't wait." Her expression shifted, a mix of confusion and annoyance. "Okay," she said, setting her bag down. "What's so urgent?" I took a deep breath, my hands clenching into fists at my sides. "I know about you and Trey." The color drained from her face, her lips parting as if to speak, but no words came out. For a moment, the silence between us was deafening. "What are you talking about?" she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't," I snapped, my anger bubbling to the surface. "Don't lie to me. I've seen you. At the restaurant. At the park. I know what's going on." Her eyes widened, and she took a step back, her hand flying to her mouth. "Matt, How long has it been going on?" I demanded, cutting her off. "How long have you been sneaking around behind my back?" Tears filled her eyes, and she shook her head. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling. "Then tell me what it is," I shot back, my voice rising. "Explain to me how kissing another man isn't what I think it is." She didn't answer, her silence speaking louder than any words could. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that she would apologize, that she would admit her mistake and beg for forgiveness. But instead, she looked away, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she said finally, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You didn't mean to hurt me?" I repeated, my voice thick with disbelief. How do you think this feels, Lisa? Do you have any idea what it's like to watch the woman you love kiss another man? Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't stop. The dam had broken, and everything I'd been holding in came rushing out. I trusted you, I said, my voice breaking. I thought we were happy. But you, I shook my head, unable to finish the sentence. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice cracking. I'm so sorry, Matt. Her apology did little to quell the storm inside me. Sorry doesn't fix this, I said, my voice cold. Sorry doesn't erase what you've done. She sank onto the couch, her head in her hands. I didn't plan this, she said, her voice muffled. It just happened. I was feeling so disconnected, so lonely, and Trey. I held up a hand, cutting her off. I don't want to hear his name. The room fell silent, the weight of her confession hanging between us like a heavy fog. What happens now? She asked finally, her voice small. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what I wanted: revenge, reconciliation, or an escape from the pain that had taken root in my chest. All I knew was that the life we'd built together, the trust we'd shared, had been shattered. I need time, I said finally, my voice flat. She nodded, wiping at her tears. Take all the time you need. As she left for her class or whatever excuse she was using to see him, I sat alone in the living room, the silence deafening. The confrontation I'd been dreading had finally happened, but instead of clarity, all I felt was emptiness. After our confrontation, Lisa and I existed in a tense and painful limbo. She tried to talk to me over the next few days, but her attempts felt hollow, her words empty apologies that did nothing to fill the void between us. Every time she spoke, I felt the sting of betrayal all over again. She promised to stop seeing Trey. She even offered to quit Pilates altogether, but her words didn't reach me. What was the point? The damage was done. Her promises, her assurances, they were just patches on a sinking ship. At first, I avoided her completely. I slept in the guest room, not that I slept much. I worked late and took the kids out without her, hoping that the distractions would dull the ache inside me. But everywhere I went, it followed. Every quiet moment became a chance for my mind to replay that kiss, the way she had rested her head on Trey's shoulder as if he were the one she trusted, the one she loved. Lisa tried to explain herself one evening, cornering me in the kitchen while the kids were in their rooms. Matt, she said softly, her voice trembling, please let me try to make this right. I turned to her, my anger barely contained. How, Lisa? How do you make something like this right? I didn't want this to happen, she said, her eyes glassy with tears. I never stopped loving you, Matt. I need you to know that. Then why? I asked, my voice cracking. Why him? She hesitated, her shoulders slumping under the weight of the question. I don't know, she whispered. I was lonely. I felt like we weren't connecting anymore, and Trey, he made me feel seen. I know that's not an excuse, but it's the truth. Her words were like knives, cutting deeper with every syllable. Seen? I echoed, my voice rising. You think I don't see you? I've been here, Lisa. Every day, I've been here, trying, and you went to him. Her tears fell freely now, but they didn't move me. If anything, they only made me angrier. Do you even understand what you've done? I asked, my voice trembling. You've destroyed us, Lisa. You've destroyed everything we built. I'm sorry, she said again, her voice breaking. I know I've hurt you, and I'll do anything to fix this. Anything, Matt. I shook my head, stepping back. I don't even know if this can be fixed. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. But the pain in my chest, the image of her with Trey, was too fresh, too raw. The days turned into weeks, and the tension between us remained. Lisa stopped going to Pilates, true to her word, but it didn't feel like a victory. She was quieter now, her usual brightness dimmed. The kids noticed, of course. They weren't blind to the way we barely spoke, the way I flinched whenever she tried to touch me. Is everything okay with you and Mom? Our daughter asked one evening, her voice hesitant. I forced a smile, the effort painful. We're fine, I lied. Just a little stressed. She didn't look convinced, but she nodded and went back to her homework. I hated lying to the kids, But how could I explain something like this? How could I tell them that their mother had betrayed me, that she had risked tearing our family apart for the sake of some fleeting connection? One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, I left the house and drove aimlessly, the city lights blurring as tears filled my eyes. I ended up at a bar, nursing a drink as the noise of strangers swirled around me. It felt good to be anonymous, to escape the suffocating tension of home. I thought about calling anyone, but who could I talk to? My friends, my family, they would only see Lisa as the villain, and part of me wasn't ready for that. Despite everything, I still loved her. That was the worst part of it all. When I finally returned home, the house was dark, save for the soft glow of a lamp in the living room. Lisa was waiting for me, her face pale and drawn. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice a mix of worry and sadness. "Out," I said shortly, brushing past her. "Matt, please," she called after me. "We need to talk." I stopped but didn't turn around. "I don't have anything to say." She stepped closer, her voice trembling. "I know you're angry. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I'm begging you, Matt. Don't give up on us." Her words hung in the air, heavy with desperation. For a moment, I considered turning around, taking her in my arms, and trying to salvage what was left. But the image of her and Trey, their kiss, her smile, it was a wall I couldn't break through. "I can't do this right now," I said finally, my voice hollow. I left her standing there, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. That night, as I lay alone in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling, my mind racing. Lisa wanted to save our marriage, but could it even be saved? Could I ever look at her without seeing the betrayal? Could I ever trust her again? I didn't have the answers, but one thing was clear: we couldn't keep living like this. Something had to change. The days turned into a blur of half-hearted conversations, forced smiles for the kids, and long nights spent staring into the darkness. Lisa and I were still living under the same roof, but it felt like we were on opposite sides of an unbridgeable chasm. Every attempt she made to reconnect was met with a wall I couldn't lower, and every moment of silence between us felt heavier than the last. I was drowning, torn between the life we had built and the pain of her betrayal. The memories of what we used to be haunted me, the laughter, the shared dreams, the quiet moments when just being near her had been enough. But those memories felt like ghosts now, reminders of something I wasn't sure could ever be reclaimed. One evening, after another day of strained avoidance, Lisa found me in the garage. I was sitting on the workbench, staring at a set of tools I hadn't touched in weeks. She stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "Matt," she said softly, "we can't keep going on like this." I looked at her, the weight of her words pressing down on me. "I know." She stepped closer, her eyes filled with a mix of sadness and determination. "I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us. But if you can't forgive me, if you can't even try, then I don't know what we're doing anymore." Her voice cracked, and for the first time, I saw how much this was breaking her too. Despite everything, despite the anger and the betrayal, a part of me still loved her. But love alone didn't feel like enough anymore. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I admitted, my voice heavy with the weight of the truth. "I want to, but every time I look at you, all I can see is him. All I can see is what you did." She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I understand," she whispered. "I've been trying so hard to make things right, but maybe I can't." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of the fridge in the corner. "I think we need space," I said finally, the words feeling like shards of glass in my throat. "I can't figure this out while we're stuck in this endless loop." Lisa looked at me, her face crumpling as she fought to hold back her sobs. "If that's what you need," she said, her voice trembling, "then I'll give it to you. But please, Matt, don't give up on us completely." I didn't have the heart to respond. Instead, I nodded and walked past her, my chest tight with a mix of relief and regret. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell the kids much, just that I needed to stay with a friend for a while to focus on work. Lisa didn't argue or try to stop me. She simply stood at the door, watching as I drove away. I spent the next few weeks staying with an old college buddy, someone who didn't pry too much and offered me the space I desperately needed. The distance gave me time to think, to sort through the tangled mess of emotions that had taken over my life. Lisa called every few days, but I rarely picked up. When I did, the conversations were brief and strained. She gave me updates on the kids, told me she was seeing a therapist, and said she was doing everything she could to work on herself. I wanted to believe her, but the trust we'd built over years had been shattered, and rebuilding it felt impossible. One night, after hours of staring at the ceiling in my friend's guest room, I realized I had a decision to make. I couldn't stay in limbo forever. Either I found a way to forgive Lisa and move forward, or I ended things for good. The thought of ending our marriage felt like ripping out a piece of myself, but staying together out of obligation or fear felt just as painful. I thought about the kids, about the life we'd built, and about whether I could ever truly let go of what had happened. The next weekend, I went home. Lisa greeted me at the door, her eyes wide with a mix of hope and apprehension. "Can we talk?" I asked, my voice steady but firm. She nodded, stepping aside to let me in. We sat in the living room, the same room where so much of our life had unfolded, and I took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about us," I began, meeting her gaze. "About what happened, and whether we can move past it." Tears filled her eyes, but she didn't speak, waiting for me to continue. "I'm not going to lie to you, Lisa. What you did broke me. It broke us. And I don't know if things will ever be the same." She nodded, her hands trembling as she gripped the edge of the couch. "But," I said, my voice softening, "I also know that I love you. And I don't want to throw away everything we've built without trying to fix it." A sob escaped her lips, and she covered her mouth, her shoulders shaking. "Matt, I'll do anything," she whispered. "Anything to make this right. It's going to take time," I said. "And it's not going to be easy. But if you're willing to put in the work, so am I." She nodded, her tears flowing freely now. "I am. I promise I am." That night, for the first time in what felt like forever, we sat together and really talked. About the pain, the betrayal, and the steps we needed to take to heal. It wasn't a resolution, and it wasn't a promise that everything would be okay. But it was a beginning. Our journey wasn't over, and the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. How do I even begin to rebuild trust with someone who looked me in the eyes every day and lied? Can I ever believe her words again?